Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Atlantic Forum Spring Conference, and thank you for joining us on this Sunday morning. In this panel, by the title Climate Change, Can NATO Take the Lead? Me and my excellent speakers will address the fundamental question of what role NATO can have in tackling this global and increasingly more urgent issue. This is hardly a rhetorical question. On the contrary, it requires a serious reflection, both within NATO and relevant civil society stakeholders. The first issue to be addressed is, why should NATO take an interest in climate change? In fact, whereas NATO is a regional defense organization, albeit with a global scope, climate change is by nature a global phenomenon, touching on all facets of society, economy, and politics. To further complicate the matter, as Mr. Van Wil affirmed in his introductory speech, the causal connection between environmental change and conflict is not immediate nor intuitive. This is because the rising temperatures alone are not enough to indicate that there will be more conflicts or more instability in the future. Rather, environmental change will be reflected indirectly on peace and security. How? As the Assistant Secretary General suggested, what rising temperatures can do is make food and water more scarce and natural disasters more likely, especially in the most vulnerable regions of the world. In turn, this might trigger political confrontations among governments willing to secure the necessary resources for their people, sometimes to the detriment of others. Eventually, political confrontations can turn into open conflicts, resulting in the displacement of people, mass migrations, and rising inequalities, and even in the disruption of global supply chains. In this way, what started as a non-military threat can become a harbinger of insecurity for allied countries. For NATO, this means that the future environment in which it will operate will change dramatically. If the alliance wants to remain an effective security provider, it needs to fulfill the three tasks that Mr. Van Wil mentioned earlier. In particular, the first one, awareness, requires NATO to understand the implications of climate change and to adapt its strategies and capabilities accordingly. Being aware of the challenges that environmental change will bring about means taking into account that the threats of the future will not be exclusively military in nature. In the contemporary world, poverty, the difficulties in accessing clean water and nutritious food, and vulnerability to natural disasters can be as disruptive as armed conflicts. In this context, being safe and secure does not only imply the absence of war, but also the possibility to conduct a dignified life. As a consequence, military security and environmental security are both of an existential importance, and they should be treated as two inseparable aspects of security. Once having identified the link between climate and security, it would be useful to assess the ways in which environmental change can affect Allied security at a strategic level. To corroborate the Assistant Secretary General's statement that extreme weather events will likely increase in number and gravity, the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report ranks extreme weather as the number one risk in terms of likelihood. In addition to that, climate action failure ranks number one in terms of impact. This means that if we fail to address climate change quickly and effectively, the negative impact will be worse than the one caused by weapons of mass destruction, cyber attacks, and infectious diseases. This is due to the fact that, according to the report, climate change is striking harder and more rapidly than many expected. The last 5 years are on track to be the warmest on record. Natural disasters are becoming more intense and more frequent, and last year witnessed unprecedented extreme weather throughout the world. In sum, we may think that climate change is less worrisome or less disruptive than, let's say, violent conflicts, cyber attacks, or terrorism. But data shows that this is not quite the case. On the contrary, NATO will still have to provide deterrence, defense, and ultimately security for all its citizens. But it will have to do so in a scenario where our planet is increasingly, more or less literally, catching fire. This means that, on the one hand, NATO will have to closely monitor the areas of the world that will likely be affected by the worst effects of climate change. On the other hand, it must give extra attention to the protection of its own critical infrastructures. In fact, our ports, airports, roads, power plants, no matter how technologically advanced, are vulnerable to extreme weather conditions. Of course, this vulnerability might attract the unwanted attention of ill-intentioned actors, willing to exploit the potential difficulties to pursue their own agenda. But the impact of extreme weather conditions is not only strategic, it can be operational and tactical as well, and affect every single domain of operations. For example, variations in climate will affect air operations in several ways. Aircraft performance during takeoff and landing is directly dependent on air temperature, pressure, and wind. Rising temperatures can degrade an aircraft performance and may require runway extensions or engine updates, as it has already occurred in Afghanistan, actually. Furthermore, the higher frequency and intensity of sand and dust storms, especially in the arid and semi-arid regions, will increasingly impede operations due to visual flight restrictions. Finally, as planes and in particular cargo planes should avoid areas with strong turbulence, mission planning, transportation and logistics may be further impaired. NATO's maritime capabilities will also face a number of challenges, both in cold and warm environments. In the Arctic, for example, the main problem will be the combination of extremely cold air temperatures with high wind speed, ice obstacle, icy waves, increased radiation exposure due to the depletion of the ozone layer. In addition to that, weapon systems and ammunition must be adapted to the extreme temperature conditions and rapid changes. Remoteness must also be taken into account, as space weather effects, coupled with high navigation demand, can cause failures or inaccuracies in GPS systems. In warmer waters, the situation is equally dire. For example, increased salinity in the Gulf of Aden has caused turbines on several UK frigates to fail. In the same region, instability due to drought, desertification, and famine has led to an increase in piracy, thus demonstrating how the consequences of climate change can affect NATO operations also indirectly. We can expect equally severe impacts on land operations. Operating in increasingly extreme climatic conditions will present challenges for military personnel. For example, reducing the supply of drinking water. Plus, a recent Pentagon report has found that more than 50% of US military bases, including operational bases abroad, are at grave risk from flooding, extreme temperatures, strong winds, drought, and wildfire. Extreme climatic conditions can also cause faster wear and tear of equipment, and the heat can physiologically affect soldiers. Finally, the space domain is not immune to climate change either. Launch facilities are typically close to shorelines and just marginally above sea level, thus putting them at risk from sea level rise. For their part, alterations to wind patterns could influence launch trajectories for satellites and missiles, challenging the viability of space operations. In short, it is evident that NATO will have to take into account the changing climate when planning future operations. In other words, it needs to pursue the second task that the Assistant Secretary General has previously pointed out, adaptation. In this sense, NATO can play a fundamental role in contrasting climate change, and the most immediate way to do so is to make sure that its operations are low impact. How can the alliance achieve such a result? There are many steps that can be undertaken. Reducing the reliance of military camps on fossil fuels, and more broadly, working on reducing the logistical footprint of operations. Conforming to conditions on the ground, for example, avoiding the use of heavy equipment where not necessary, or modify it to fit the actual needs of the soldiers. NATO can help partners to come up with methods to improve their resilience against climate-related threats, and finally, NATO can, should, and actually is including climate change consideration in exercise planning in order to improve preparedness. However, all of these actions, although meaningful and useful in allowing NATO to adapt to the changing environment, cannot reverse the trend towards increasing temperatures and extreme weather conditions. Political actions are needed at a global level in order to fulfill the third task to contrast environmental change, mitigation. To be sure, NATO and its members have their own instruments and ways to contribute to the global struggle against climate change. For example, all NATO countries are members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. The scenarios developed within this framework demonstrate a solid scientific and national consensus and thus have the potential to generally guide political action. Furthermore, although only recently the climate change dossier has begun to take more and more of a high profile, NATO has been involved in protecting the citizens of allied and partner countries from the backlash of environmental change and natural disasters for decades. For example, through the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center, NATO's principal civil emergency response mechanism that has been used both in allied territory and out of area to provide relief against natural disasters. Most recently, on the 23rd and 24th of March 2021, NATO foreign ministers approved a specific agenda on climate change and security. An action plan is expected to follow, specifying what NATO will do to increase awareness about environmental change in order to make the alliance more and more capable to operate in a new environment and to mitigate the effects of climate change. However, NATO alone cannot resolve the challenge. It will need better coordination with other organizations and institutions who have the power to actually put a limit to CO2 emissions and develop useful legislation as well as enforcement mechanisms. In fact, environmental change is a global issue, and thus it would be noble but irrelevant and possibly even detrimental if only a group of countries were to act against climate change while the rest of the world proceeds with business as usual. Plus, NATO remains a defense alliance. Therefore, other international committees and agencies may be better equipped to tackle the non-military aspects of climate change. However, NATO's participation in action against climate change resonates with other initiatives undertaken by different organizations, such as the EU's Green New Deal. This is something that suggests that there actually is common ground from which to start building a comprehensive strategy in the future. Finally, NATO will need to interact more organically with other non-institutional stakeholders, researchers, scientists, engineers, and representatives from the private sector and industry in order to be able to procure the most advanced technologies, which, in turn, will empower the alliance to maintain operational effectiveness while reducing environmental impact. Only in this way can NATO be in step with the times and remain capable to defend its citizens while also positively affecting the transition towards a greener world. Now, I thank you for your attention, and I would like to introduce the first guest of this panel. Mr. Michael Roulette is head of the Hybrid Challenges and Energy Security section at the NATO Emerging Security Challenges Division. He has a long career in the NATO international staff, as well as being an estimated writer on security and defense, and most notably for today's discussion about environmental security. Michael, I want to ask you, can the Atlantic Alliance take the lead of the green transformation while also maintaining its nature of a defense alliance? And at the same time, how can NATO better interact with other international organizations interested in climate change, such as the European Union, the OSCE, and the UN, in order to implement this broader vision of security? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and congratulations for a great opening speech. You said it all, so not much left for me and Katarina to say, but let me try anyway. On your major question, can NATO take the lead? I think that lead role will not be played by NATO, as you alluded to in your own remarks. I think what you expect from a leading organization is that it can, for example, set limits on CO2 emissions, and this is something for the United Nations. That's something for the EU. Less so for NATO, but NATO can of course make a substantial contribution to the broader efforts of the international community, in particular as far as the security implications of climate change are concerned. After all, if you know, the annual Oscar is not only going to the best actor, it's also going to the best supporting actor. That's usually a Brit. He's not as good looking as the American, but his English is better. So I see us more in the role of the really good understudy, still worth an Oscar, I hope, one day. In contributing to the fight against climate change, the first good news story is that NATO does not have to start from scratch. We have been doing a lot of different things. We have built what I would call an acquis that will help us in charting the course in the years ahead. Now, I haven't seen my boss's presentation this morning, but I think some of the things he said may be worth repeating here. First of all, we have been supporting climate change-related research for decades. The interest of nations in supporting this research has kind of been down because some allies felt, well, this is not a NATO issue. Others felt very much it was a NATO issue. So we're now seeing an upswing again in interest in these types of research. We have, again, since the 1970s, introduced environmental protection standards into our military. We have courses on how to protect the environment, for example, when you're setting up a camp. So this is also a long-standing policy of NATO. We have, of course, accumulated experience in military, in humanitarian relief operations, because our militaries collectively and also nationally has been employed in many different missions over the years. We have achieved perhaps more military and procedural interoperability than any other group of states in the world. I think when it comes to interoperability of equipment, but especially procedures, I think NATO is the international gold standard. And I think this is something we can also carry over into the environmental field. We have, of course, a large network of partner countries, which we have diligently built over almost 30 years now. And some of these partner countries are perhaps far more seriously affected by climate change, at least in the short run, than NATO allies. So this is an important factor that we must consider as well. And as you said in your introduction, we have also started to exchange best national practices on reducing the fossil fuel consumption in our militaries. So the building blocks for a more visible role, a more coherent role of NATO in climate change are clearly there. But as we seek to raise NATO's profile on the climate dossier, we need to take great care about doing it right. And what do I mean here? Well, first of all, I think we should not militarize climate change. So our use of terminology will be very important. We often use words like combating climate change. Sounds good, rolls off the tongue easily, and many people will use it and see no problem with it, but I think it can also scare away other people. So we have to be very cautious about how we define, what terminology we define as we move forward on the climate dossier. My second point, and you've alluded to this already yourself, we should not pit environmental security and, let's say, traditional military security against each other. NATO's main job is to provide for the security of almost 1 billion citizens, mainly by using military means for deterrence and defense. That's our main job. That's the essence of what NATO is all about. And this means that we can adapt our military posture to a climate changed world. In fact, as you said very, very strongly, we have to adapt to a climate changed world. And we can also look at mitigation measures, but we cannot change into a humanitarian relief agency. I'm saying this deliberately because I'm often in my discussions with climate activists, I'm getting this story that NATO should somehow demilitarize and therefore use all its resources to focus on humanitarian stuff. That would probably make sense if the only threat that we would have to deal with in the world are the forces of nature. But unfortunately, we also have to deal with the forces of human nature. And therefore, we need to maintain our deterrence and defense role. And so the challenge is not to have a competition between two narratives, two job descriptions, but actually find synergies between them. And I think that's what our job is all about. And my third point is, as we move along, we must manage expectations, especially when it comes to mitigation. Over time, our forces, very much like everything else in our societies that runs on fossil fuel, will eventually decarbonize. I think that's clear. In 50 years, it would be odd if the military are the only people in the world who use diesel fuel and the rest of the world is doing something else. So we will have to go with the flow, but this cannot come at the expense of fighting power, of combat power. So the real challenge here is to find the right path for a military green transition. This means we have to identify technologies that reduce emissions while maintaining carbon effectiveness. And the good news, again, another good news story here, is that there are many such technologies out there that could help us achieve this goal. Of course, we have used wind, solar in as you've mentioned it yourself, in some camps to bring down the diesel fuel consumption. But there is also more. I mean, we can have better energy distribution through smart grids, in other words, through computers. We have technologies that special coating for ships that reduce the water drag, and many more. And just a little anecdote, which I didn't believe at first. I just came across it 2 weeks ago. I read an article I found very hard to believe, but then my expert said it was actually correct. If you park the windshields, the windshield wipers of a plane vertically instead of horizontally, as planes are usually doing, right? When you don't use them, they come down like this. If you park them like this, the air drag will be reduced. This was just recently found out. And the US Air Force believes by parking the windshield wipers differently, they can save $7 million annually. Unbelievable. I never believed it, but my colleague said, no, this is correct. So there's a lot of stuff we can squeeze out of our military if we have a closer look at what do we consume and why, finding the right ways of measuring consumption and then doing something about it. But despite all that, the military will remain for the foreseeable future a major consumer of fossil fuel. Let's face it, a tank will not run on anything else but diesel for quite a while. So, and let us also not forget that not all allies will have the money to simply throw out their old equipment, the dirty equipment, and replace it with modern, clean equipment. That's another factor that needs to be considered. We must never lose sight of that. Now, as far as your second question is concerned about cooperation, I think with other organizations, I think there is. I'm very positive. I'm very optimistic. NATO has a proven track record of cooperation and dialogue with other institutions. I think we have long understood that security today cannot be managed by just one institution alone, that you need partners, institutional and national, private sector, scientific community, and the like. And I think we have cultivated a cooperation with all these players. And when it comes to those organizations that you mentioned, the UN, the OSCE, and the EU, I think we have long-standing relations with all three of them. We're already discussing themes ranging from counterterrorism to hybrid threats. So expanding this dialogue by including climate change should actually be a kind of natural step, next step. As I said earlier, the UN and the EU are both setting limits on CO2 emissions. And NATO therefore needs to take account of these limits because it cannot be a separate entity on this. So because these limits will eventually also have to be reflected in the military. So dialogue is not just a nice to have thing. It's actually essential for us to know, the compass in which direction we're going. We could also push the envelope a little ourselves, of course. We could organize regular high-level events, for example, with the EU, with the UN and others, to look together at climate change. And we're actually trying to figure out the way ahead on this one, for example, right now. But such events, of course, should have concrete outcomes. Having people in suits and costumes talking about how terrible climate change is, I think we have enough of these meetings. So we need to have meetings that are meaningful, that actually lead to concrete outcomes, to concrete research programs, aid programs, whatever. So we need to make sure that if NATO organizes, for example, invites others for let's say an annual large event, we know what we aim at, an outcome that is actually accessible to people, understandable, and really value added. Our key institutions need to be seen not just as lamenting, but as doing something concrete. As I said, it's too soon. We're working on this right now. It's too soon to speculate what these concrete actions should be that come out of such events. That's something we should find out together as we prepare for them. Albert Einstein once said that knowledge emerges through dialogue, and that's the kind of dialogue that I think would hopefully lead to more knowledge. And the climate dialogue, I think, is all the more important. So in a nutshell, I'm sometimes reminded of the when I look at climate change, NATO. I'm sometimes reminded of the play by Molière, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, because in this play, the protagonist gets an explanation between the difference of poetry and prose. And when he learns what prose means, he suddenly realizes, very happy, that he has been speaking prose all his life. He's very happy about that. And in a way, I feel that NATO is in a similar situation. When it comes to climate change and environmental security, we've been working on environmental protection standards, supported scientific cooperation on climate change, water security. We tested smart energy technologies long before the term climate change started to dominate the headlines. So in other words, we were speaking prose long before the poetry was put on top of it. And I think this bodes well for NATO's ability to make progress on the climate change dossier, not as the leader, but as a very, very good supporting actor. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, not only for this interesting insight, but also for further clarifying that when we say that NATO should lead the climate change, we do not expect it to change in NATO and turn into an environmentalist organization, nor to start producing legislation, but just to set an example of what means to have an environmental friendly organization that also provides defense, because that's its core task. I would like to introduce now my second speaker and guest for today. Ms. Katarina Kertisova is a policy fellow at the European Leadership Network in London, and last year she was nominated as a NATO 2030 Young Leader by the Globsec Policy Institute. Her research experience includes work conducted for the UNDP, the Carnegie Moscow Center, Globsec, the Klingendale Institute, and the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, which is impressive for such a young lady. Also, as a member of the core group of experts of the OSHA Perspectives 2030 initiative, Katarina contributes to research focusing on new technologies and risks they pose to human rights and political processes across the OSHA area. Katarina, what I would like to ask you is a similar question, but with a different focus. So, what about NATO tackling the issue of climate change while maintaining the effectiveness of NATO's defense posture? So, how does NATO combat climate change? How does combating climate change intersect with the need of granting security to the citizens of the Euro-Atlantic area? And in other words, what are the main security threats that are emerging from climate change? And consequently, how can defense priorities conjugate with the need to prepare for 2030 through climate change, climate transition, digitalization, and a more advanced protection of human rights? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sherry, for the invitation to you and your colleagues at the Atlantic Forum. It is a pleasure to be here today and to share the stage with Michael and to have the opportunity to present some of the takeaways of our NATO 2030 Young Leaders report. So maybe I'll start with that. The bottom line of our report was that NATO, to be able to continue to fulfill its core mission and respond to future threats, it needs to provide security differently in 2030 and beyond. So we need a more holistic understanding of what constitutes security today. We see that with the impact of climate change, many organizations are changing their purpose. So, oil and gas companies are becoming energy companies. But in case of NATO, its purpose remains very much the same, providing and protecting the security, peace and security of almost 1 billion people that reside within the alliance. But to be able to do that, it has to enlarge the way it looks at security. And that means incorporating challenges like climate change, incorporating or looking into new technologies and the way they intersect, the impact of pandemics, and the list goes on. So when NATO was formed, it was really formed as an alliance to protect the members against external aggression. And when we look at climate change, it's really a faceless enemy. It doesn't have any flag, it doesn't have any combatants, but it still destabilizes societies worldwide, and it impacts our peace and security. So it's not really a typical attack that was envisaged under Article 5. And also, if we recognize that global warming is man-made, we are our own adversary in this fight, and it might be it might be impossible to trigger Article 5. And to echo what Michael has said, so NATO does not seek to lead in this process. So it does not consider itself to constitute the solution, but it is part of the solution. As you have mentioned in your opening remarks, it is a global issue. Climate change is a global phenomenon. It doesn't know any borders, and it requires a whole of government response. It requires a multilateral response, and the security institutions need to be part of that response. I would say that before we look at what NATO could do better, which is what we try to do in the climate chapter of our report, maybe I'll outline a few limitations to what NATO as an organization can do when trying to tackle climate change more effectively. So unlike the EU, NATO can legislate and set emissions reduction targets. That falls under the competence of nation states. Second, NATO is a consensus-based organization, so its agenda only reflects what member states can agree on unanimously. And the political will to do more on climate change is still evolving across the alliance. And I think that the agenda that was agreed and adopted is a step in the right direction, and it's a positive signal in this regard. And also, NATO has a limited collective financial means in the civil budget to do more on climate change. So, although NATO is unlikely to lead in the fight in the fight against climate change, it still has important assets through which it could make a useful contribution in comparison to other organizations. Some of these have been mentioned, but I just want us to be aware of that. I think that one of NATO's strongest assets is that it has a solid network of partners and structured relations with other international organizations. And climate change is really an ultimate team sport. And this network side is very important, not just for capacity and resilience building, but also for the sharing of best practices and for improved situational awareness. Second, NATO can serve as a useful hub when allies can come together and exchange expertise and best practice. And I think that this sharing of best practice is needed for NATO members to better understand the benefits of green transition. You know, we would say seeing is believing, and this is where NATO could play a useful role. As we have heard, as Michael has mentioned, NATO has a long and successful track record as a standard setter. So, you know, through the standardization agreement, NATO can set standards not only what type of equipment allies operate, but also how they operate. And also what NATO does has normative influence on NATO's partners across the globe. You know, it's still, NATO comprises half of the global military and economic might. And also, you know, because of great operational planning, militaries can deploy and provide aid faster and more effectively than, you know, humanitarian agencies and organizations or other civilian agencies. And this list goes on. And in our climate chapter, we list several concrete recommendations which we think NATO could adopt, could take to do more on this agenda. Maybe I would just mention one or two, and I hope that our followers will read our report after the event. So we have heard, you know, NATO trying to help allies measure their military emissions. You know, at this moment, we don't really know what those emissions are because they are not, there aren't any uniform metrics for allies to calculate their emissions, and we need to know that to be able to set baselines and to move to setting voluntary targets. So in this regard, NATO could really help. NATO could also set green targets for defense spending. So let's say a 25% fuel efficiency increase, higher standards for military facilities, you know, cleaner equipment and support solutions, etc. And then on the maybe preventive side, or on the side how NATO could better understand the conflict and instability implications of climate change, I think here these partnerships that I have mentioned play a crucial role, military cooperation programs and diplomatic tools to really understand the situation on the ground and to be prepared to respond in time. I hope we can touch upon some of these issues in more detail during Q&A, but for now, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Katarina, also for referring to the work of NATO Young Leaders, which I think is extremely interesting for the Atlantic Forum patrons. Going back to Michael, but remaining on the threats that descend from climate change, I have a question which is actually a genuine curiosity of mine. And what I want to ask you is the turn towards cleaner energy going to cause a seismic shift in international relations? For example, relying on renewables will mean using different materials to produce, let's say, engines. Therefore, raw materials will likely come from different regions of the world than the ones that supply us today with materials and energy. So how does this affect the political stance? And of course, I'm referring particularly to China, with which NATO members are deeply involved and deeply connected in commerce on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, I think we see already the shift energy world going on for quite some time. And the first major shift we've seen over the last 10, 15 years was, of course, in the traditional fossil fuel world, when the United States, for example, due to fracking and due to the liquefaction of gas, became shifted from one of the greatest energy importers to one of the greatest energy exporters. Much to the dismay, I would think, probably of others, more traditional fossil fuel producers like Russia, like the Middle Eastern countries, and so forth. So we already seen in the traditional fossil fuel world a huge shift, which of course has geopolitical implications. One of the things we do at NATO, and this is now I'm putting on my energy security hat, is having expert discussions, including with the NATO Council, on the security implications of such energy shifts. Because what do you do if you have countries in the Middle East who have been banking almost exclusively on selling fossil fuel? What do they do if the amount of fossil fuel that they can sell goes down, if the prices are going down? How can these states continue to remain stable? So these are questions which are very interesting. Also, the question if gas is cheaper and more gas opportunities are there, you can buy your gas now like oil on ships. You don't need pipelines anymore. What does it mean for a country that uses pipelines as a means of power, like Russia? So these are very interesting questions that we try to tackle within NATO as well as in many other places. But you're right, it will go much further when we electrify our economy, our transportations landscape. We need lithium, we need other rare earths, of which China seemed to have almost a monopoly. But I think this will change as the requirements go up, demand goes up. Then it becomes more interesting to look for lithium and other elements in other places as well, Latin America, Africa, whatever. So there is a huge shift already ongoing. Also, when we electrify our societies more and more, and we have smart meters at home and what have you, we will be even more. We will save a lot of energy. That's good for the climate, but we'll be even more susceptible to cyber attacks. So cyber, in my view, which is already, I think, one of the number one problems we're facing, will be even more critical. Finding solutions, enhancing resilience of our societies, enhancing cyber defenses, not only of NATO but of the private sector, which is the key sector here. So all of this means our view of what energy is, what geopolitics is, which countries are playing a key role and which are sort of in decline, will radically change over the next 20 years or so. NATO is more or less an observer of these events, but as we try to play a role in environmental issues, as we try to get a better grasp on world events, I think looking at the energy shift, the energy transition, is a key part of the strategic awareness that we need to improve.
Thank you, Michael. This is a really interesting topic because, of course, you have big players that now rely on exporting energy, but maybe they have the opportunity to adapt as we are doing. And then you have small players, small regional countries whose economy is deeply entrenched with exporting oil and gas. And of course, instability may descend from electrification and the green transformation. Now, going back to Katarina, I would like to ask broadly, what is the role of the youth in countering climate change, and more specifically, how NATO young leaders can help disseminate the concepts that and the ideas that they came up with during their discussions. And also on a more specific aspect, how can NATO and the private sector, for example, young entrepreneurs, young business leaders, cooperate more synergically in the future in order to pursue a coherent agenda and effectively tackle climate change? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sherry. So on the question of youth, I think, to put it more broadly, I think my generation perceives security challenges differently than other generations would. Some of us have not experienced the Cold War. Some of us have not experienced, living in zones of conflict, so we perceive threats a little bit differently. And for some of us, climate change is really something that we are worried about. And I think that polls show that these opinions diverge. I think that youth activism in this regard, if you see the positive impact that Greta's work has had, the positive impacts of Climate Fridays, it is really a moving force behind a lot of the action on the climate agenda, so bringing it on the agenda, getting the conversation going, highlighting the risks. So I do think we have been contributing positively to the discussion, and I'm glad that our opinions are being invited and are being considered and hopefully incorporated into the next strategic concept. Shari, would you mind repeating the second part of the question for me?
The second part of the question is how NATO can better cooperate with the private sector, but I mean specifically with young entrepreneurs and young business leaders promoting new ideas that are deeply connected with climate change. And how can NATO and these representatives from the private sector agree on a coherent strategy for digitalization and green transition?
So I'll try to answer the question. I hope that maybe Michael can complete on the basis of his experience. I think that traditionally, defense industry was the one that was leading in terms of technological innovation. But when it comes to green adaptation, it hasn't necessarily been the case. So a lot of the green innovation is taking place in the private sector today. So I think that NATO and, defense sector in general, these synergies are necessary not just to be aware of, what is coming to the market, but also, to help set standards upfront on what these technologies are. NATO and militaries have also a significant buying power, so they can really drive green transition in the industry. So I do think that it is important for the defense sector to cooperate, with the private sector, with the startups, with young innovators and entrepreneurs. But we really need this, ecosystem of stakeholders. So it's not just the private sector and the defense organization. You also need knowledge institutions. You need NGOs. So we need to think about it in terms of an ecosystem.
Thank you, Katarina. And Michael, would you like to add something on the topic of NATO and private sector cooperation?
I think Katarina said it exactly right. I think the fact that most innovation today comes from the private sector and not from the military sector is a sea change in the way we look at how to get technologies into the military. And we have done outreach to the private sector on cyber, for example, where you can't do cyber defense without talking to the software companies. We've done it with emerging technologies now. And I think the same will be true in not too long, not too distant future when it comes to specific, let's say, green technologies. We work already with the scientific community. What we also like to do, and we've just started to do that now, is to use our science program for what we call top-down projects. In other words, we define where are the gaps in our knowledge on certain technologies or certain, let's say, knowledge on environmental issues that we need to fill, and then we look for universities or other players, to individual scientists, to help us out there. So we have to be clear that we get our knowledge today from many sources that in the past we would have probably not been too interested in looking at. So there is a new way of work at NATO and also elsewhere. We need to bring a real, Katarina said, ecosystem. I can only agree. It's kind of a multi-stakeholder system that you need to get going. And I think NATO has been showing in the past that it's quite open to this. There is always a limit. Of course, if you talk to 2 or 3 companies who are competing with each other, you need to be very careful how to handle this. We cannot exchange classified information. There are lots of obstacles that hinder a smooth dialogues or smooth cooperation, but I think these are things that eventually will be overcome.
Thank you. Of course, I also think that reaching out to new stakeholders is the most sensitive thing to do, because NATO in this way can outsource the production and the production of new technology, but also the new idea and the formation that is required can be outsourced not only to companies, but also to universities. And from there, NATO can draw the best experts, the best leaders, the best entrepreneurs. Now, going back to the issue of cooperation, I want to ask you a question about developing synergies in military operations. And in particular, a good example of the possibility to develop these synergies would be in military mobility. Can NATO benefit from the military Schengen, which for our patrons is one of the initial projects launched under the European Union's Permanent Structured Cooperation in Defense, and that is aimed at making sure that the passage of troops happens unimpeded in case of a military operations on European territory?
That's to me or to?
To Michael, yes.
Okay. Military Schengen is a very, very good idea, and it's a very important idea, because the way in which we organize defense at the eastern part of NATO requires the rapid dispatchment of reinforcements in a crisis, because we have a very thin military presence in the theater. So we have found out that moving troops through Europe towards, let's say, from Europe's west to Europe's east is incredibly bureaucratic. We had crossing borders is much more difficult than we had thought, because in the Cold War, most of the infrastructure that we needed to transport troops was in state hands. Today, it's in private hands. So it needs to be, you need to have regulations in place. You need to have agreements in place that allow you in a crisis to work as unbureaucratically as possible. And this is what military Schengen is trying to do. So I think it's very important for NATO for its traditional deterrence and defense side to have a smooth border crossing and so forth, border crossing procedures and so forth in place. Of course, if you can cross borders quickly, this will also be of a bonus when you are, let's say, going into a humanitarian relief operation. This could be a flood in the Balkans or what have you, as we've had in the past. Actually, it could be an earthquake in Pakistan, as we've had in the past. So having the procedures in place that allow you quick and unbureaucratic movement of troops and especially of equipment, which is particularly important in humanitarian relief operations, is absolutely crucial. In 2005, when we had this devastating earthquake in Pakistan, and we were sort of around the corner in Afghanistan, we airlifted 3,500 tons of equipment to Pakistan, to the region that was most affected by the earthquake. So you must be able to deliver quickly and unbureaucratically. And I think the more pre-agreements we have in place for these kinds of eventualities, the better, both for traditional deterrence and defense as well as for humanitarian relief, let's say, as a result in response to climate-induced catastrophes.
Absolutely. And maybe one of the main differences in NATO operations today is how immediate threats are and how quickly we need to respond, whether it is a military threat or a humanitarian disaster. And of course, the more natural disasters you have, the more humanitarian relief operations you have to envision. So on this topic, I would like to ask Katarina if she thinks that NATO should rely more on the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center and in general on its Center of Excellence to respond to climate-related threats, especially as they are, as I mentioned, immediate. They need immediate response and they need immediate help. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Shari. So on the question of Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Center, maybe that goes back to my earlier comment about the fact that NATO has several tools at its disposal that can be helpful, for example, for climate emergencies. But not only, the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Center, if I'm not mistaken, has also proven useful with the pandemic. So maybe one thing to know about it is that it's a very reactive construct. So nations have to request support for the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Center to be activated. We also have the Rapid Response Force, if I'm not getting the title wrong. So there are multiple tools at NATO's disposal. And I hope that Michael could maybe build on this with some additional ones. But I do think this is a useful tool, and we have seen it has proven its usefulness during the pandemic.
If I may come in here, I agree with everything what Katarina said. The EADRCC, the longest acronym ever. The EADRCC was basically a small office with 2 or 3 people and a telephone. During the pandemic, we had to build what some people refer to as surge capacity. We had to. I think it ended up with almost 20 people because we had to take people from all over the house and send them there, because the requests were coming in so quickly. And of course, many of these requests, not surprisingly, came from partner countries who sometimes don't have the infrastructure to deal with the distribution of medical aid, for example, the way we can do this. So what you have to have in the future, at a minimum, is a surge capacity. You don't have to have 20 people in the office all the time. But you must be able, and this must also be pre-planned, of course, to augment a staff in a certain part of NATO within a day. Because if you have 2 or 3 humanitarian crises at the same time, then you will be very, very busy in coordinating responses. We also, as a result of the pandemic, started to do lessons learned, very self-critical process. Where did where did things go wrong? Where were we too slow? Quite brutal actually, looking at our own failures in responding to the pandemic fast enough. Where did we not inform, or where did the EU and NATO lack in mutual information? Could we have been better if we had informed each other of some issues more quickly? So these are the things that we also will have to do when we get more involved in environmentally related disasters, as opposed to the medical disaster we've had. We have to constantly review our own mechanisms, our own staffing procedures, to always be, on top of the issue. In the pandemic, I think we lost a couple of valuable weeks because we were not entirely clear. Nations were not entirely clear how much of NATO they should use and how much they should do on their own, or how much EU they should use as opposed to NATO and whatever. So when we assume, and I assume you're correct, Shari, that we will have more humanitarian disasters in the future where we would have to engage, we need to iron out these things and not lament afterwards what we've done wrong. So we need to be very agile here and make sure that the organization is really ideally staffed and educated and has the right technological gimmicks in order to respond more quickly and more effectively. But I think this organization wouldn't be existing for 72 years if it hadn't been constantly reviewing its own mechanisms, procedures, and so on, and make sure that they fit. And also, by the way, we have, of course, Katarina spoke of a number of things we have at our disposal, instruments. One of the most important instruments, in my view, are our educational facilities. COE, Centers of Excellence, you mentioned one. Some nations have now stepped forward and they want to have a COE on climate change. We will see where this is going. I think some nations are interested in this. We have the NATO Defense College in Rome. We have the NATO school in Bavaria. We have schools where we can run not only environmental protection courses, which you already do, but we can also educate our future military leaders, our future diplomatic leaders in the intricacies of climate change and what it means for security. So when we change the curricula of some of our educational facilities, I think we will also make a huge contribution to a kind of a higher level of awareness, politically as well as militarily, on the need to do something about climate change. So we have a great resource there as well.
Yes, before I mentioned how NATO can outsource education to universities, but of course, where the organization sees it fit, it can create its own schools, its own classes and courses. So I have one final question for the both of you. Actually, the first part is rather technical, so this goes to Michael, and that is, how is climate change taken into account when planning exercises and operations? And the final question is, how is the scenario for future operations changing? For example, COVID-19 showed that the military can be a much needed relief force under certain circumstances. So should we expect NATO to proceed in the direction of supporting more disaster relief operations? Thank you. The floor is yours, Michael.
Of course, climate considerations are already part of mission planning, as you said, Shari, in your opening remarks. If I go to Afghanistan, I know what the temperature is like. I know that the sand is a huge problem for my helicopters because it's sucked into the engine, and it requires filters, which in turn reduce the torque of the engine. You mentioned another example of the salinity of water, which affects the turbines of ships. So I think as a mission planner, I'm not a mission planner, of course, but a mission planner will know these things. But of course, he can only then plan on if he has very accurate data. And if he assumes, let's say that the temperature is 40 degrees during the day, but it turns out it's actually 42 because our data was too old, this can already have an effect on a number of, it can be kind of a chain reaction in terms of military performance. But our goal, of course, is to mainstream climate change throughout the entire NATO enterprise, not just in the planning, which means force planning, which means procurement, mission planning, exercises, and also partnerships. In other words, we want to look at every angle of NATO and see how climate change affects these things. In my view, the biggest challenge is procurement. When you think of how long it takes to design a system, a helicopter, let's say, and how long it takes until it finally goes into the armed forces, and then it will be used for 40 or 50 years. You need to know now what kind of helicopter you need in 2060. Exactly. How do you do that? You need extremely good data. You have to extrapolate. You have to speculate, maybe to some degree. And this, I think, is an incredibly difficult challenge. We need to basically determine now in what kind of scenarios we will use our forces in 30 years from now, or even longer. So that, I think, is a massive challenge for each, not only defense ministry, but also for for the companies that work on modern equipment. So it's very important that we as NATO, 30 allies, sing from the same song sheet when it comes to the question of how will climate change affect our future security environment. What kind of security environment are we likely to face and operate in 30, 40 years? I don't know how this is being done because I'm not a climate expert. And of course, you know that when you have 3 experts, you have 5 opinions. So it will be very difficult to find a common ground here, because you will have allies who will say, well, yeah, that's all fine, but we have more immediate problems right at our doorstep. We are in the here and now. And others who will say we need to look at what's going on in 30 or 40 years. So bringing the allies together, that will require, I think, more years probably of discussion, and it will in particular require even more intensive outreach to the climate community, because they are ultimately the ones who can tell us what the world of 2050 or 60 will look like. So another reason for NATO to reach out to the scientific community and look at how they see the evolution of the world. It's even more complicated, I guess, because as we pass more tipping points, which mean that certain issues are irreversible, they will simply continue to go worse. And they reinforce each other. It's even more difficult, I think, to make long-term predictions about how this planet will look like, what the average temperature is going to be on this planet in 30 or 40 years from now. So that's a huge challenge, but I think it's a challenge we cannot avoid. We just have to address it.
Yes, this is exactly where my question came from, because as I was doing my research, I noticed that there are certain devices or new technologies that can only function at a specific temperature, and 2 degrees more or less can make the device make mistakes or stop working. And this is why we need to think ahead of the times, think 30, 40 years from now, and where are we going to be in 2050 or 2060. Katarina, I would ask your final remarks, and I repeat the second part of the question, and it regards the future scenario for NATO operations. NATO demonstrated to be a fundamental relief force during COVID. So do you envision NATO operation continue to maintain this humanitarian and relief aspect?
Thank you, Sherry. So I think I'll start by building on some of the ideas that Michael has put forward, and I hope I'll answer the second part of your question. When it comes to the exercises, one thing I wanted to mention, because it was a thing I found very interesting, an interesting fact when I was participating in the Young Leaders Program, is that since 2013, NATO is organizing these biannual capable logistician exercises, where some green technologies are tested. So it is being tested, and I think this is an interesting example. Environmental considerations were also part of the Trident juncture exercise in 2018. So I just wanted to mention these two examples. When it comes to thinking about what kind of helicopters or weapon systems we will need in 2060, so really looking at this as the sense of direction, if we imagine that in 2050, 2060, our biggest threat, or the biggest threat to our national security, comes from, the belt of instability and from flows of migrants, we are coming to the realization that that kinetic means alone are not going to be sufficient, so our tanks might not help us with the challenges we'll face in 2060. So, we are speaking about the greening of the militaries, but, some weapon systems, I think, will become obsolete just because of this overall direction that the threat landscape is taking. Another thing that was mentioned, and that was, building intra-alliance cohesion. At this moment, the climate security nexus to some extent divides allies. So all NATO member states have submitted their climate pledges in the run-up to COP21, but they are still divided, on how fast the energy transition should happen, and also, to what extent NATO should be engaged on this subject. And there are several reasons that play into this mix, and one of them is political. So on the one hand of the spectrum, with countries, like the UK, Italy, the Netherlands, Canada and France and others, which really side with this agenda. And this is very evident in the run-up to COP26. But, on the other side of the spectrum, we have Central and Eastern European countries that have been heavily dependent on coal, and that are also very cautious about the speed of green transition. And that, that doesn't only affect the military, it affects all sectors. Let's say, Poland, for example, opted out from the net zero emission target by 2050. And Slovakia, only a few days ago, declined to sign, a climate emergency. It was a non-binding statement, which it declined, the parliament declined to sign. So NATO can help allies build and strengthen consensus in this regard. Yes, so I think that would be my closing remarks. I think you're muted.
Sorry, sometimes one click just doesn't work. And I wish to thank you both. Your final remarks were extremely interesting, especially because building consensus is something that NATO needs to constantly work on. It has worked on this issue for 72 years now, and it's even more important now that the range of challenges and threats, but also of opportunities for development, are broadening more and more. So really, time does fly by, and I want to thank you for participating in this discussion and for taking our questions, which have been collected through a couple of months of research on the topic. And I really want to thank you on behalf of the Atlantic Forum for dedicating your Sunday morning to educating us on the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.